Bruchim Abayim, Morai B'Rabotai, continuing on our journey through Hilchot Shabbat Be'iyun, and we are starting Seif Yud. We're hoping to be able to do Seif Yud, Yud Aleph, and Yud Bet today of Siman Shin Chaf Aleph. These are the details of Hilchot Tochein on Shabbat. Can you grate cheese on Shabbat? Can you cut salad, Israeli salad, to small pieces? Can you prepare puree food for children or for elderly adults with the way they're usually done during the course of the week? These are all questions that we're going to be discussing. So Maran Shulchan Aruch writes in Seif Yud, Asur ligror hagvina b'Shabbat b'morak charus bar pipiot shkorin ralyo. It is prohibited to grate cheese with a professional grater, because this is, as the Mishnah Berurah writes, is a problem of uvdin dechol. You usually use this same kli to use during the week, and that becomes a problem. In other words, even though the cheese is not considered gedule karka, is not grown out of the ground to have issues of grinding. Again, we spoke last week about those who are machmir even with non-gidule karka. We spoke about the Chazon Ish and others. But nevertheless, put aside the issue of Tochein, it is going to be an issue of uvdin dechol. Now, says the Rivash, and this is the Rivash in Siman Kuf Pei Dalet, that is prohibited to do this grating of cheese on Shabbat, which the Shulchan Aruch paskins. And just to give a preface about Gidul Karka part of it, Rabbi Moshe Levi writes in his Tshuvot Tfilah LeMoshe. Moshe Levi was one of the great Sfardi Achronim of the previous generation. He passed away, unfortunately, very young, in his 50s. He learned Be'ikar in the Ashkenazi yeshivas, but
Slicha, the worker says he's going to turn off the...
Tell me when you're ready. Mm-hmm. So the Rav Moshe Levi, we were speaking about, Rav Moshe Levi writes in his Tshuvot in Tfilah LeMoshe in Chelek Aleph Siman Memchet. Again, he was one of the luminaries of Halacha. He wrote some fantastic Sfarim both in Hilchot Shabbat and Hilchot Ribit and Hilchot Brachot, and his Tshuvot that are available in their, I think by now, 7 halakim of his writings that have been put out. He writes in the first volume of his Tshuvot in Siman Memchet about Gidul Karka that Tchina is Tochein, Isur of Tochein is only by Gidul Karka, and that's only things that are derech to do Tchina. But if you have other items that usually the world also is accustomed to grate them to small pieces, then you have the Isur of Tochein by them as well when you make them small. For instance, he says if you have sardines and you want to crush them to small pieces, like a tuna type of thing, which tuna is the derech of the world to eat tuna, then according to him will be a problem if you're not doing it for immediate use. We'll see just in a moment that immediate use changes the whole perspective on Hilchot Tochein. Or for instance, you have hard-boiled eggs, you want to make egg salad. You want to make egg salad, if you're a woman of a house, you wake up early in the morning, and 6 o'clock a.m., 7 o'clock a.m., 8 o'clock a.m., you want to make already the tuna salad or the egg salad ready for the Suda, or even better, for Suda Shlishit. Says, Menucha Da'ava, that's Asur. You cannot do that. Now, Chacham Ovadia, in his Chazon Ovadia, Shabbat Chelek Dalet, on Daf Resh Zabech Zayin, he disagrees with that. He says there's no Tochein really on things that are not gidule karka. So it's like a little machloket over here when he gets to items that are not gidule karka. You're making egg salad, you're making tuna salad. Again, tuna salad, the way we have by regular tunas, also could be a problem because the tuna chunks, right, that are literally pieces of tuna flesh inside there without them being crushed to smaller pieces, that according to Menucha Dava also is like sardines. It will be the same thing if you have the chunks. That would be the same issue. So it says, if you take a look at your pamphlets on page 169, we're just going to quickly go through the first two seifim, which is less to discuss. He brings the language of Shulchan Aruch, that's asur, and I'm just going to read from the actual Shulchan Aruch. Asur ligror hagevina b'Shabbat b'morak charus bal pipiot shkorin ralio. It's asur to do this. He says that the Aruch HaShulchan in Seif Tetvav explains that even though the cheese is not subject at all to the constraints of grinding, because it's not Gidul Karka. Now, well, we discussed already the Gidul Karka debate of it, but even if it would not be an issue of Tochein, because it's not Gidul Karka, and you would think that it's mutar to grind them, but says the Aruch HaShulchan, you cannot use a grater. You could cut them into fine pieces, to small pieces, but you cannot use a grater, because it is usually used for isur. It's therefore uvdin dechol, and also it's a klishe melachto leisur.
Any difference on Yom Tov?
The general rule would be in this specific thing a little different in Yom Tov. So there are more kulas on Yom Tov than this on Shabbat. But again, Yom Tov has its own restrictions as well. It has its own heterim, has its own restrictions as well. So it says for instance, Chao Badia over here says you could take a fork and try to smush and puree food for small kids, young kids, if it's lesorach ota seuda, which again, this if Yud and Yud Aleph really run into Sif Yud Bet, which we want to get into because the details of whether or not the altar for immediate use making a difference is really discussed there. Now, how about if I have a knife? I have a knife and I want to cut something to small pieces with my knife. Does it have to be la'altar also or not? So Rabbi Moshe Levi that we mentioned in Menucha Dava, he says that if you're using a sakin, if it's not la'altar, it's asur to cut it to pieces even with a sakin, even with a knife. But again, Chacham Ovadia and the Kaf HaChaim, they agree with the Mishnah Berurah over here that would be mutar. So let's read this inside. The Magen Avraham and the Mishnah Berurah both say that it is asur to use even immediately, even if it's immediately prior to eating. Using a grater would be asur because it's just like borer, similar to borer, where a proper kli is prohibited, even immediately prior to eating. So they already the first ones who draw this parallel between the halachot of borer and the halachot of tochen. Mishnah Berurah over here in Seif Yud already makes this similarity, this parallel, that just like by Hilchot Borer, even if you're doing ochel mitoch pesolet, it would be asur. If you're doing it bekli, here also using a special kli that's made for grading for tochen, it would be asur. So therefore, anything that's made for tchina, even if you have a heter to cut the things to small pieces, will be asur. So let's go through this. If you have these choppers that are made for cutting vegetable to very small pieces, and this is a kliya miyuchad, that would be asur to use on Shabbat, right? So even though that you could take a knife and prior to your Suda, immediately before, cut Israeli salad and use it, but using a chopper would be very similar to using a grater for cheese, and that would be asur because of this halacha. Now, as we mentioned, even with sakin, the menuchad ha'ava is machmir if it's not immediately before, but the Ben Ishchai, Chacham Obadia, Hilchot Olam, on that Ben Ishchai, the Kaf HaChaim, and the Mishnah Berurah, they're all mekel, that with a knife you could cut them to small pieces because they're not gidulei karka, where you're talking about cheese or you're speaking about meat, that would be all mutar. And that is basically Sif Yud. Now, you could use a saw also, or one of these like large knives, even though that saw by itself is klisha melachto leisur. You can't use a hammer or a saw because the majority of their work is with melacha, that's asur. You could use a klisha melachto leisur lesorech davar mutar, and that would be also permitted. So says the Shulchan Aruch in Sif Yud Aleph now. Mutar lehashkot et hatalush kedesh lo yichmosh. A slightly different halacha. We're going to again come back in Sif Yud Bet to continue Sif Yud. But Sif Yud Aleph, Maran writes, you could wet the detached vegetables in order to prevent them from withering away. We don't want them to dry up. You could put them in the water or sprinkle some water on them, and that is mutar. Now, the chidush of this seif is that you're not required to be careful to only do this for things that you're going to use for this Suda. You want to use something for Suda Shlishit, at the end of Shabbat, and right now you want to just make sure that it stays fresh and does not wither. That's mutar. Now, how about if I don't need it to eat it? So Mishnah Berurah writes that would be asur. Let's read the language of Mishnah Berurah over here. Hainu yerakot telushin. This is fit for being eaten today. Therefore, it's mutar lashkotan. You could water them, you could sprinkle water, put them in the water, all mutar. When something is not ra'ui la'achila, for instance, you have hadassim. You want to put them in the water for besamim. Can you put them in the water on Shabbat? Says the Mishnah Berurah, you cannot. Asur litroach bishvilam. It's asur to work hard for that. And says the Mishnah Berurah, later on in Shulchan Aruch in Shin Lamed Vav, we're going to discuss this again. Of course, if something is in a pot already and it's attached to the ground or to dirt and its roots and everything, that would be, of course, the isur of zri'ah, is isur d'oraita. So says the Mishnah Berurah, Uchli cheres im isve bosem bebayit, gam ken asur lashkota b'Shabbat. When you have good smelling plants, also asur to water them on Shabbat, which is again pashut. Now, Chacham Obadia writes in Chazon Obadia in Chelek Dalit on page Resh Nun Zayin that before that, Obadia has a tshuva in Yechavedat in Chelek Bet that he discusses putting lulav and etrog and hadassim, all these things in water, so long as they don't have blossoms that are going to open on Shabbat when you put them in the water. So Chavadia writes in Chavadat in in Chelek Bet, in Siman Nun Gimal, that it is mutar to put them in the water on Shabbat. Hadassim, all those things they want to put on Shabbat, so long as they don't have closed flowers that they're now going to open, the blossoms are going to open, that you shouldn't do, because it looks like you're growing something. It looks like the water is doing something, but the other things you could put in the water, no problem. Now, this basically brings us to Seif Yud Bet, which is the main endeavor we're going to involve ourselves with today, which is one of the main seifim of this siman. It's also very interesting to see how one piece of Gemara, or better said, two pieces of Gemara, could create such a drastic machloket rishonim and machloket poskim. Really all starts from a Gemara in Masechet Shabbat, Daf Ayin Dalet Amud Bet. The Gemara there says that if you are doing parim silka, right, it's the language of the Gemara. Parim silka is chayav because of tochein. Now, what is parim silka? Silka usually we translate as beets, right? What's parim? So Rashi there says, afanot, on the Gemara itself, Rashi says it's cutting to small pieces, right? Cutting finely these pieces of silka, which again Rashi seems to say that it's beets. It will be asur, and you talk about the Gemara saying you're chayav, it's isur doraita, right? Cutting it to small pieces. The Tosafot right there in Daf Ayin Dalet, and pay attention to this because we're going to need to redefine the Tosafot in just a moment. But the Tosafot understand that this is grinding, and the Tosafot say that this only applies to beets. Right? This issue only applies to beets, say the Tosafot. You're grinding beets, it's asur. Fine. Now, the problem with that is, if you go to Masechet Shabbat a little bit later, and Daf Kuf Yudalet Amud Bet, there the Gemara says that you could cut vegetables on Shabbat. There's no problem with cutting vegetables on Shabbat. And the Tosafot in the Ramatchil Kenevat Yarak, they asked the same question. Say, wait a second. And Daf Ayin Dalet, the Gemara said if you cut beets to small pieces, you're hayav. And over here, you say you could cut vegetables. So what's the pshat over here? Right? So it says, the Tosafot. The answer that a person is chayav when you are cutting the vegetables to small pieces, but if they're not very small, then it's mutar. Now, what's the problem? The obvious problem is in Daf Ayin Dalet, they said that it's only with beets that you become hayav. In Daf Kuf Yudalet Amud Bet, the Tosafot says that any vegetables that you cut small pieces, it's going to be asur. But if you cut them to big pieces, that's going to be mutar. So you see already a little problem with the Tosafot over here. And actually in the notes, if you pay attention, this is asked as well. This is that the vegetables are not only beets, but even the vegetables are asur. And if you say that's only beets, the Tosafot could have answered, well, the Gemara in Ayin Dalet is talking about beets. The Gemara in Kuf Yudalet is talking about vegetables. So you see that Tosafot don't hold that it is only beets. It's pashut that the shita of Tosafot is when you cut vegetables to small pieces, it will be a problem. Now, Sefer Yereim, the Maran Bet Yosef quotes. He says the cutting applies to all vegetables. Basically, the same shita as the Tosafot in Kuf Yudalet that we just mentioned. Now, Rabbeinu Asher brings Shita of Rabbi Hananel, who explains that this parim silka that the Gemara says in Daf Ayin Dalit is referring to chopping wood to small pieces. Parim silka means chopping wood, however you slice that, right? Pun intended. So the Rosh continues that he has a problem with Rashi's explanation. So this becomes again a part of Machloket Rishonim, and the point of bringing these 3 or 4 things is not to confuse you further, but to first of all see that the shita of the Tosafot is the vegetables is a problem, and you're talking about the potential chiyuv chatat. Secondly, to show that this is a very wide range of Machloket Poskim. You could have all the way from Rabbeinu Hananel that talks about wood, silka means wood, and then Tosafot means silka means only beets, and then Yereim and the other Tosafot hold that silka means every vegetable. Now, what's the halacha? At the end of the day, this is pretty confusing. Now, Rambam and the Rashba are very important pieces of information because we end up paskening like the Rashba, and Maran ends up not paskening like the Rambam, which is also very interesting. So, therefore, let's learn them together. Now, Rambam in Perek Chaf Aleph, Hilchot Shabbat, Halacha Yud Chet, Rambam is of the opinion. He actually puts all the Gemarot very nicely together. Rambam holds it depends on what is the derech. If you have fruits and vegetables that are eaten raw, edible raw, and you just want to make salad, I could bite into the tomatoes and cucumbers and by myself. So, but making a salad is just a way to make it available and nice and proper. Says the Rambam, that's nothing to talk about. That's mutar. Because the Torah does not prohibit how small the food has to be when you eat it. But, says the Rambam, if you're doing it lesorech bishul, if you're cutting them to small pieces, in order to prepare them as bishul for cooking, then you have all these Gemaras that they talk about the prohibition and the isur that we just mentioned. That's the shita of the Rambam. Now, but Maran Bet Yosef actually specifies this. It says Rambam only holds this asur to cut to fine small pieces if it's the sorech bishul. Things edible raw, no problem whatsoever. That's the Rambam. Now, Maran deviates from this Rambam in just a moment, but the Rashba holds, and this is the Rashba in the later Gemara in Kuf Yudalit, the Rashba writes that the Kinevat Yarak that the Gemara brings is not talking about cutting vegetables, because that's already Asur in Ayin Dalit. In other words, the Rashba understood the Parim Silka, that it's obviously not only talking about Selek, is not obviously not only talking about beets. If beets are Asur, every vegetable is Asur. That's how Rashba understood Ayin Dalit. So once he gets to, it's a very logical discourse, Rashba, like it always is, amazing. Rashba says the Gemara in Ayin Dalit is talking about all the vegetables. That's Asur. So once he gets to Kufi Dalit, says the Rashba, what is this talking about? Can't be cutting vegetables. That's mutar because that's Asur. So what is Kinevat Yarak? And the Rashba says it is talking about washing vegetables, not cutting up vegetables. It learns completely different shot in the sugya. Now, Rashba now seems to hold that a person could eat it right away before, but not with a distance of time. Because Rashba writes in Tshuva, this is in his Chidushim on Masechet Shabbat, but in the Tshuva, Rashba writes the Torah does not prohibit how small the food has to be for you to eat it. Like chewing could be, if you chew something not for eating, it's also grinding, right? You're just chewing it for making it small pieces. But the Torah does not prohibit grinding something by the means of chewing it to small pieces, or specify how small it has to be for you to eat it. Eating is mutar. Anything that's considered process of eating, it will be mutar. So anything immediately before will be considered mutar as well. Like Yaakov Yosef, Yitzchak Yosef writes, what is it considered right before? So he writes, if you're doing it b'toch ha'seudah, for sure is mutar. And even if it's not mamash b'toch ha'seudah, if it's right away before, then it's mutar. So therefore, says Yitzchak Yosef, don't start preparing these items that are questionable in Hilchot Tochein, before your husband start coming from the shul. You want it once they get home, or you know that they gotta get home. Right immediately before Suda, that's when you start doing it. So that's the Rashba. If you actually take a look at the Tshuvot Rashba is brought in your pamphlets in a different page. It would be nicer to put the two Rashbas together, but in 172 he brings the Tshuva of the Rashba that cutting beets or any other vegetables. Again, he understands the Gemara in Ayin Dalet. It's not limited to beets. It's every vegetable is the same. It's asur when you're cutting it for a later use. But cutting it prior to eating, mamash, right before, it's mutar. Because they never prohibited a person from eating food in small or big pieces. There's no restrictions on that. And he is, again, one of the first sources that draws this parallel between Hilchot Borer and Hilchot Tochein, as we saw in the Mishnah Brura. Comes really from this Rashba. So therefore, Maran writes from this Rashba, you see that you could cut salad finely to small pieces. Again, not using a grater, not using a chopper, which is a kli hamiyuchad, but you could cut it with knife to small pieces, make a nice Israeli salad immediately before Seudah, no problem. That's what Maran writes. And we'll see that that's the halacha as well. But at the end of the day, Maran writes, don't make it too small. Don't make the pieces too super small, because that becomes already its own question based on the Rishonim that don't differentiate between right before Seudah or long before Seudah. There are those who say Hilchot Tochein has nothing to do with borer. You can't grind, and cutting it, dicing it to small pieces is considered grinding it. No time restrictions, are just asur. You can't do it. So Maran says, even though that we are allowing it, don't make it to too small of a piece, because you get into this issue. Now, I want to just mention, yes.
How small is too small?
Again, it's very hard to know how small is too small, because Chazal did not give inches and centimeters and millimeters, and nor do the Rishonim. So when you go to the stores and you have a professionally made Israeli salad, that is too small. That is too small.
Dicing is...
Again, there's dicing and there's dicing,
Let's talk about things like parsley. That's when I get a little worried.
So again, the question is, if you do it a little bigger than how it's usually done, then you'll be in the safe zone with Maran over here. So again, in our home, if the Israeli salad is made before Shabbat, Chazak u'Baruch. If you're making it in Shabbat, we know that it's going to be a little larger pieces, clearly larger pieces than what you were doing in regular preparation of Israeli salad. So to be machmir for this Maran. Now, I want to tell you that Maran is going to say something that comes as a bit of a surprise. I'll read to you the language of Maran over here. Maran writes in Seif Yud Bet, "Hamechatech hayarak dak chayav mishum tochen." You cut up pieces of vegetables to small pieces. You are chayav mishum tochen, right? Now, what did Rambam hold? It's no problem, absolutely no problem going to Rambam, right? Well, absolutely no problem is the language of Rambam. The Chazon Ish takes this Rambam and says, no, it means it's not chiyuv, it's still Yisur D'Rabbanan. right? But be that as it may, the simple understanding of Rambam is that there's no problem, and the Rosh Paskins the same way. The Tosafot, the Ra'ah, Sefer Truma, Meiri, all of them, they hold that to cut something, to small pieces, even if it's perot ve'erakot, still is mutar. And Maran says it's asur. Maran, again, was choshesh because this is a potential isur d'oraita. Perhaps you should be more machmira. Chaim writes that because you have so many rishonim who are mekel, if you have another snif lahakel, if you have another reason to be lenient, then you could use a safek sveka even against Maran, and you could be mekel, right? Same is Rabbi Shlomo Levi in Menuchat Ahava in his Sefer on Hilchot Shabbat in Chelek Bet Perek Chet, he writes that one shinui, a little shinui of how you going to cut them or make them prepared will be sufficient because, again, we recognize all these Rishonim. It deals with the list of the Rishonim that Chacham Ovadia brings as well, and therefore they're both willing to be a little bit more mekel when it comes to this. Now, once speaking about Menuchat Ahava, he says right over there in Chelek Bet Perek Chet that even when you want to puree something for little kids or for the elderly that can't eat it, right? Even if it's things that are edible raw and you want to prepare it for them, it will be asur according to Maran. Maran is completely machmir, even though that, again, we said the Rashba, all these, they would say it is mutar. Maran is, not the Rashba, sorry, the Rambam, the Tosafot, the Ritba, the Meiri. The list is a long, long list. Sefer Truma, Yereim. Maran is machmir at the end of the day. But says the Menuchat Ahava, that's only if you're making it far apart from the Seudah. If you do it immediately before Seudah, that would be mutar. Because we paskin like this Rashba, that there's no restrictions on how you're going to be eating this. So this is one element of it that Maran writes. Maran comments on the issue of cutting the vegetables finely, and the Ramah now brings a whole new list of halachot, which we're going to go through them B'ezrat Hashem one by one. The Ben Ish Chai, by the way, once we add this, the Ben Ish Chai writes that this is like melach. You remember last week we spoke about the Ben Ish Chai's psak by, grinding melach, and we said we need two different shinuyim, two different changes that you make. First of all, it has to be on the table or in a bowl, and secondly, with the back of a spoon, back of a knife, the handle of a knife. That's the two changes. So he holds that here also you need two, unlike the Chacham that we said even with one thing would be mutar. Now, says the Ramah, והוא הדין דאסור לחתוך גרוגרות וחרובים לפני זקנים. It will be asur to cut carobs or dried figs in front of elderly, again, because even though that a regular person would be able to eat this, we don't go after the majority of the world. We don't. So you're doing it for this person. You have to judge it based on the person that you're preparing it for, and therefore, says the Ramah, asur to do it. The asur lachtoch gerugarot v'charuvim lifnei zakenim. Can't do it for them because that's considered now you're making it edible. It's tochein. V'davka perot v'chadome. Only for fruits it becomes asur. Aval mutar, says the Rama, it is permissible. Lefarer lechem lifnei tarnegolim. This is the second part of the Rama, which introduces the concept of en tochein achar tochein, en tchina achar tchina. That because bread was already ground up as flour, and now you made it into bread, therefore piecing it apart from each other again would be mutar. And this, we mean to say that even if you're doing it an hour, 2 hours before, you're preparing the food for your chickens, whatever it is, even an hour before, that's mutar. Says the Mishnah Berurah in Ot Mem, if you take a quick look, Hainu afilu la'achin lahem sheyochlu la'achar zeman would be mutar. That's en tochen achar tochen, right? Give me another example of en tchina achar tchina. What do you say, Chacham Elazar?
Matzah cereal.
Huh?
Matzah cereal.
Matzah cereal is another piece of it, right? It will be any of those things that have been, but there is exception. For instance, the exception is if you have a clump of dirt that has been dry mud on your thing, you cook to say, oh, we learned the shiur, and tochen achar tochen. So this was small pieces of sand, whatever, and now I could just, whatever. Forget about the halachot of melabin, right? Not so quick. That would be asur. What's the difference? What the Chazon Ish writes this. What's the difference? The difference is when you make bread, tchina is now forever changed, right? Now, so therefore, now if I put it to pieces, now it's mutar, separating into pieces. But by dirt, there's no difference, right? When you put some water and it becomes clumped together again, it's like what it was before. So it's almost like undoes the process that you had before, and therefore it's still asur after it's clumped together to break it to pieces. That would still stay asur. So it has its restrictions. It has its differences still with the regular cases, even though again that dirt is not gidule karka, it's karka itself, right? It's not considered gidule karka, but as we mentioned before, non-gidule karka also have their own issues, at least on a drabanan level, as we mentioned. So says the Ramah, therefore, it's mutar to piece away, crumbles of bread for the chicken, even if you're doing it an hour before, 2 hours, 3 hours before, it's no problem. The hoil v'kvar nitchan en lachush, the en tochen achar tochen, right? V'chol ze lo mayri ela bechotech umaniach. All of this, and this is the $1 million piece. All of this that we mentioned, that's asur, all the isurim that we mentioned is when you are cutting them and leaving it for afterwards. Aval im leochlo miyad hakol shari. If you're doing it for immediate use, then it is mutar midi dehave borer leechol miyad deshari. Just like when you want to do borer, which would be borer ochel mitoch pesolet, would be mutar lealtar. And this is the tshuva of the Rashba that we mentioned earlier on, which the Rama is paskening like over here. And again, it's not just the Rama. Chacham Obadia in his Chazon Obadia, in Leviat Chen, other places as well. I'm just going to read to you 2-3 sentences of his most recent sefer of Chazon Obadia, Chelek Dalet. And what I'm reading to you is on page Resh Nun Gimel and then Resh Nun Hey. Mutar laduch timarim ve'egozim b'Shabbat. Well, I should have given a little preface to this before starting it, because this comes from a Ben Ish Chai, both in the Ben Ish Chai that we mentioned and also in Rav Pe'alim in Chelek Bet, the Ben Ish Chai writes, he's very much troubled with the minhag of Baghdad. It seems to be in Iraq. They had this minhag to crush different nuts together with dates and so on. And the Ben Ish Chai is troubled how it's mutar. So he spends a lot of time in Rab Pa'alim Chelik Bet in Orach Chaim Siman Mem Bet discussing this. And Chabad is bringing it because of that. It says Chabad is mutar to crush dates together with walnuts and whatnot. There used to be like a mush that they had, a healthy mush of nuts that they used. I think in Iran also we had this. I don't know those who remember this, right? I still remember. I just right now I had flashbacks to childhood. They had this thing that they would make like crushed nuts, especially walnuts, together with tamarim. Some people didn't want to crush it; they would actually fill in the tamarim with walnuts. Anyone remembers that? Yeah. Yes. Okay. This one is more popular. Everyone remembers that. So the reason that they would do that, those who are machmir like this, the hava minhag of the Ben Ish Chai, but the minhag in Baghdad, the Ben Ish Chai is not so happy with it. But the minhag in Baghdad was that they did it. Hamadia says mutar laduch temarim. It's mutar to do it, and egozim, walnuts, all that. Lesorech zekenim ve'eladim. If you're doing it for people who need to have it mushed to be able to eat it, or lesorech chole, for a sick person, ubilvad sheyaduch beshinui. So long as you're doing it beshinui, right? You do it with the back of a knife, right, with the handle of a knife, or with the biyata machtishet besidah sar she'ena derech laduch. Anything that's not the derech, it's mutar. Says Chacham Badia. Now, says Harabadia, mutar lechatchila. Even lechatchila is mutar. Lerasek banana, to puree a banana. By the way, banana is the language of Shulchan Aruch. When Maran talks about what bracha you make on bananas, is mozish, right? That's Arabic. Moz, Arabic and Farsi is the same thing in that way. But to crush and to puree bananas in Shabbat will be mutar. Even lechatchila or yirakot mebushalot b'shinei hamazlek. Even if you're doing it with the tooth of a fork, will be mutar lesorech machal latinok kedei la'achilo la'altar. Doing it immediately, mutar, no problem. V'chen mutar lerasek v'nimrach banana or avocado. If you want to make an avocado sandwich and you want to smear the avocado on your bread, right? Crushing it as you smear it there, mutar, right? If you want to do that, or again, bananas will be all mutar, provided that you're doing it la'altar. You're not doing it for after a few hours. You're doing it mamash right now to prepare for your eating purposes. That would be mutar. And then he writes on page Resh Samechei, what we mentioned before, Ha'mechatech yarak dak dak. This is where he paskins this Shulchan Aruch. Le'aniach l'seuda acheret. In order to leave it for a different seuda, chayav mishum tochen. Says Chaubadia, you're talking about a chiyuv d'oraita. Aval im le'echol la'altar. But if you're doing it for now, mutar. Umutar la'asot salat v'lachtoch ha'yirakot dak dak al da'at lechol altar. You could do it al da'at lechol altar. So here again, even though that Maran Shulchan Aruch in Bet Yosef writes, don't dice them too small, Haravadia doesn't necessarily even bring it here. Because again, he feels that we go with the Rashba 100% that there's no shiur in eating how small or how big it has to be. So that becomes really the core halacha, the ma'aseh, as far as Tochein is concerned, when you're talking about doing it la'altar, right? Now, this is again the Magen Avraham. The Mishnah brings this Magen Avraham in Biur Halacha that Magen Avraham says you could cut small pieces, mamash small pieces, for those people who don't need them to be cut to small pieces. In other words, the Ramah says for zekenim you can't do it. Magen Avraham says, okay, but for non-zekenim you could do it. You could do it mamash even to small pieces, right? And that's even if you're doing it hours before. You understand? That's an explosive Magen Avraham. And the Biur Halacha brings this Magen Avraham, and he disagrees with the Magen Avraham. The Chafetz Chaim in Biur Halacha, in Dibur HaMatchil Lifnei, he disagrees with this Magen Avraham vehemently, and it says it's always asur to do it small pieces if it's not mamash right before eating it, right? So that's one kula that we spoke about having suffix feka. The Magen Avraham becomes one element of this kula when something is edible in larger pieces for healthy people. We're not talking about zekenim or yeladim. That would be mutar. Now, the Tshuva of Rav Moshe Feinstein, I'm going to try to cover in the important things with the few minutes that we have allotted to us. Rav Moshe Feinstein writes in Igrot Moshe that even though that there is room to be mahmir, but when it's necessary, for instance, you want to feed an elderly individual or a little kid, they can't eat big pieces, hard pieces, and you want to cut it to small pieces for them, you could finely cut the food before the meal, because cutting finely before the meal for eating purposes always mutar according to baseline halacha, and therefore for a situation of sorech you could do that no problem. And that's the tshuva of Rav Moshe Feinstein. Actually, if you want to go through this tshuva, it's kedai, or for those who have the pamphlets, if you take a look at the end, the last page of 176 and 77, you have the tshuva of Rav Moshe Feinstein in its basically entirety mentioned over here, dealing with the Ramah and this risuk of bananas. The main core element that he's talking about is again pureeing bananas and other food for elderly and for the young children, and he says that mikar adin that would be mutar. Now, how about a cleaver? So the Mishnah Berurah brings that even according to the lenient opinion, it's asur to use a cleaver, because that is considered a kli hamiyuchad. It's considered like a grater, basically, right? Aruch HaShulchan says, what grater? This is a knife. Just because it looks more scary because it's wider, it doesn't make it a not knife. It's a knife. It's a special knife. It's a knife. So therefore, he holds the mikar adin. There's no special kli over here, and it will be mutar. Rav Moshe Feinstein basically paskins like the Aruch HaShulchan also against the Mishnah Berurah, and that's the ikar halacha as well. And if you want to use a cleaver to cut, that will be fine. Now, this Rav Moshe Feinstein that we mentioned holds that mashing bananas, it's not does not conform to this definition of cutting things to small pieces, because the banana is not reduced to small pieces, right? You're just mashing it together. He quotes the Chazon Ish, right, that says that bananas are not subject to Tochein at all. The Chazon Ish holds, which again others disagree with him, but Chazon Ish is considered a serious shita in this. He holds that a person could mash bananas with a handle of a spoon or fork, as a shinui, and that is going to be completely mutar. as we mentioned before, the cooked vegetables and the bananas, Chacham Ovadia says you could do, so long as you're doing it for immediate use right before, you could do it with a fork or with a spoon, no problem with that whatsoever. So that basically is the main gist of the halachot in Seif Yud and Yud Bet, which are interconnected for both the Sfaradim and Ashkenazim. Be'ezrat Hashem will continue in the next shiur, going further in Shulchan Aruch. Chazak u'baruch.